The Elven King laughed, unaware of the human's secret. Your human tricks are nothing. You'll see. Suddenly, the gates burst open. The grand hall of Luminaethel gleamed with crystalline light, each pillar carved from living moonstone that pulsed with ancient magic. Lord Vaerion Silversong sat upon his throne of woven starlight, surrounded by his war council, elves whose lifespans stretched back millennia, whose mastery of the arcane arts had shaped the very mountains outside. Before them stood a delegation of humans, mud still clinging to their boots, their armor plain iron that looked almost pitiful against the radiance of elven silver. At the center of the human group, a weathered man named Bastien Moreau held what appeared to be nothing more than a wooden stick with an iron tube attached. Lord Vaerion's laugh echoed through the hall like crystal bells shattering, and his council joined him, a chorus of elegant mockery that made the humans' faces burn with shame. "You dare bring this before us?" Vaerion's voice dripped with amusement, his fingers lazily weaving flames in the air, magic as natural to him as breathing. "Your great innovation? A stick? We have lived 3,000 years, little human. We have seen empires rise and fall. We command the elements themselves. And you offer us sticks?" The other elves tittered, their perfect faces illuminated by the soft glow of their inherent magic. One whispered loud enough for all to hear, "Perhaps they plan to poke us to death." More laughter. Bastien's jaw tightened, his knuckles white around the rifle stock. Behind him, his engineers stood rigid, holding identical sticks, their eyes fixed forward. They had traveled 2 weeks through hostile territory for this audience. They had gambled everything on this moment, and now they were being dismissed like children presenting toys to scholars. We'll find out what happens next in just a moment. But first, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's get back to the story. 6 months earlier, the Kingdom of Valdombre had been prosperous in its own humble way. The fields yielded grain, the rivers ran clean, and the people knew peace, or at least the absence of war. The kingdom's capital, Grenfel, sat nestled in a valley surrounded by ancient forests that predated human memory. Beyond those forests lay the Elven Dominion of Aethermore, a realm of impossible beauty and terrifying power. For generations, an uneasy truce had existed. Humans stayed in their valleys, elves remained in their enchanted groves, and neither spoke of the great war that had ended 300 years prior, the war where human armies were incinerated by elven fireweavers, where entire battalions were entombed in living wood, where the very earth had risen to swallow siege engines whole. The King of Aurelion received the elven emissary in the throne room on a gray autumn morning. The elf, who called himself Thalorian Moonwhisper, entered without escort, his robes shimmering with threads that seemed woven from moonbeams themselves. He was impossibly tall, impossibly graceful, and his eyes held the weight of centuries. The message he delivered was simple and absolute. Aethermore was expanding its borders. The forests of Valdombre, every tree, every stream, every sacred grove, now belonged to the Dominion. The humans had 1 season to evacuate their homes and relocate beyond the eastern mountains. Resistance would be met with the full might of elven magic. Thalorian spoke these words without malice, almost with boredom, as if announcing a change in weather patterns. The king's advisors erupted in outrage. Lord Chancellor Genevieve Roux demanded to know by what right the elves made such claims. General Etienne Beaumont declared they would fight to defend their homeland. But it was a quiet voice from the back of the chamber that changed everything. Bastien Moreau, the kingdom's master engineer, stepped forward. He was a man in his 40th year, with calloused hands stained with soot and a mind that saw the world differently than others. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice rough from years of working in the forges, "I may have an alternative." The room fell silent.
Bastien had built Valdombre's bridges, designed its fortifications, improved its mills and irrigation systems. He was respected, but war was not his domain. Aurelian gestured for him to continue. "I've been studying something," Bastien said carefully. "An ancient human technology from before the Elves subjugated us. Something they dismissed as too primitive to ever threaten them. But I believe we can adapt it, make it work, make it lethal." He pulled a rolled parchment from his satchel, schematics covered in measurements, calculations, strange diagrams of tubes and chambers and springs. "Give me 4 months," he said, meeting the king's eyes. "Give me your best smiths, your fastest riders to gather materials, and your absolute secrecy. If I'm right, the elves won't see us coming. If I'm wrong—" He didn't finish the sentence. The alternative hung in the air like smoke. The royal archives of Valdombre occupied the oldest part of Grenfel Castle, a tower that predated the kingdom itself. Stone walls 3 feet thick kept the interior cool even in summer, and narrow windows let in only thin shafts of light that caught dust motes like tiny stars. Here, bound in cracked leather and written in languages few still remembered, lay the collected knowledge of human civilization, including records from the age before Elven Dominion. Bastien had spent the last 2 years of his life in these archives, often working by candlelight until dawn, searching for something his grandfather had once whispered about. Weapons that had made thunder, that had killed from distances no arrow could reach, that had briefly, very briefly, allowed humans to stand against magic. The text he'd finally found was incomplete, water-damaged, and written in Old Terran, a dead language that took him months to decipher. It spoke of firearms, of gunpowder, of chemical reactions that could propel metal at speeds that defied imagination. The diagram showed cylinders, springs, hammers, and most importantly, the powder itself, a mixture of charcoal, sulfur, and something called saltpeter. The author, whose name was lost to time, had written desperate notes in the margins. "This knowledge must be preserved. They burned our factories. They called it primitive sorcery. But these weapons do not rely on bloodlines or magical talent. Any human can wield them. Any human can defend themselves." The text ended abruptly mid-sentence, suggesting the author had met a sudden end. Bastien had shared this discovery with no one except his most trusted assistant, a young woman named Elaine Durant, who had an intuitive understanding of chemistry that bordered on uncanny. Together, in a workshop hidden beneath Bastien's home, they had attempted to recreate the black powder. The first batch exploded prematurely, taking Bastien's eyebrows and nearly his hand. The second batch fizzled uselessly. The third batch produced a satisfying crack when ignited in a test chamber, a sound that made both of them freeze, hearts pounding. They had stared at each other across the workbench, understanding the weight of what they'd just achieved. This was forbidden knowledge, suppressed for 3 centuries because it had once made humans dangerous. Now, with the king's desperate blessing and access to the royal treasury, Bastien assembled his team. He chose carefully: smiths who could work iron to precise specifications, miners who could gather sulfur from volcanic vents in the northern territories, and chemists from the university who asked no questions when presented with unusual requests. He told them only pieces of the whole. No one person knew the complete design except himself and Elaine. They worked in converted warehouses on the edge of Grenfel, buildings that had once stored grain but now housed forges running day and night. The official story was that they were preparing agricultural tools for the relocation. The truth was far more dangerous. The first prototype rifle took 3 weeks to build. It was crude, ugly, a wooden stock attached to an iron barrel with a firing mechanism that relied on a flint striking steel to create sparks. Bastien tested it himself in an abandoned quarry at midnight, with only Elaine present. He loaded the ball, primed the pan with powder, took aim at a wooden target 50 paces away, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The recoil nearly broke his shoulder, and the smoke was so thick he couldn't see for several seconds. But when the air cleared, he saw the target, shattered, with a hole punched clean through the center. Elaine's hands were shaking as she examined the damage. "Bastien," she whispered, "this changes everything." He looked at her, his face grim. "It has to," he replied, "because we're out of time." Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of impending doom. The deadline set by the Elves was 2 months away, and throughout Valdombre, families began the heartbreaking process of deciding what to take and what to abandon. Wagons lined the roads leading east, packed with possessions that represented generations of memories. Children cried for homes they would never see again. The elderly spoke quietly of dying on the journey rather than living as refugees in foreign lands. The mood in Grenfel was funeral, except in the converted warehouses where Bastien's secret army worked around the clock.
He had 100 smiths now, 50 miners, 30 chemists, and 200 laborers. They had built furnaces that ran continuously, their fires fed by teams working in shifts. The sound of hammering echoed from dawn until well past midnight. Bastien himself slept perhaps 4 hours a night, moving between workstations to check tolerances, approve designs, solve problems that arose hourly. The rifles. He had settled on calling them that, from the spiral grooves he'd cut into the barrels to spin the projectiles for accuracy, were being produced at a rate of 10 per day. Each one had to be tested, calibrated, and approved. Each one represented a chance. But there were failures, catastrophic ones. A barrel burst during a test firing, sending shrapnel that killed a young smith named Mark Fontaine instantly. Another batch of powder ignited prematurely in storage, burning down an entire workshop and injuring a dozen workers. Bastien attended Mark's funeral personally, his face haggard with guilt. Genevieve Roux found him afterward, standing in the rain outside the cemetery. "You're killing our own people," she said quietly. "For what? Weapons that may not even work against magic? Bastien, the elves will see these sticks and laugh." He turned to her, his eyes burning with an intensity she'd never seen. "Then let them laugh," he said. "But they won't be laughing when they realize these sticks don't care about bloodlines or magical talent. They don't care if you've studied for centuries. Point and pull, that's all it takes." News reached them that the Elven army was gathering at the forest's edge, not because they expected resistance, but because Vaerion had reported suspicious activity in Grenfel. Lord Vaerion Silversong himself would lead the enforcement of the evacuation, bringing with him a host of battle mages and warrior spirits bound to Elven service. King Aurelian called another council meeting. Etienne Beaumont presented a plan. They would send most civilians east immediately, as planned, but a volunteer force would remain. 2,000 soldiers, their best, armed with Bastien's rifles. They would make a stand at the valley's entrance, where the terrain was narrow and the forest's edge created a natural boundary. "We hold them there," Etienne said, his finger tracing the map. "We show them that humans are not prey." Bastien spent that night in his workshop, alone except for the dying coals of the forge. Before him lay 50 completed rifles, their barrels gleaming in the faint light. He picked one up, feeling its weight, its balance. It was ugly compared to elven weapons. No magical runes, no inherited power, no beauty. Just iron and wood and human ingenuity. But it was theirs. Built by human hands, powered by human understanding of the natural world, wielded by human will. He thought of his grandfather's stories, of the old wars where human armies had been swept aside like chaff. He thought of the scorch marks she'd seen in ancient battlefields, where elven fire had turned sand to glass. He thought of Mark's funeral, of the risks his team took every day. Then he loaded the rifle, aimed it at a practice dummy across the workshop, and fired. The sound split the silence like thunder. The dummy's head exploded in a shower of straw. Bastien allowed himself a grim smile. "Let them laugh," he muttered. The meeting in Luminaethel was meant to be Valdombre's last diplomatic attempt. King Aurelian had sent his finest negotiators, bearing gifts of human craftsmanship, jewelry, tapestries, wines, aged for decades. They hoped to buy time, perhaps bargain for a smaller territorial concession. Bastien had accompanied them, not as a negotiator, but as a demonstration. He wanted the elves to see what humanity had created, wanted to plant a seed of doubt in their ancient minds. Instead, he found himself standing in that crystal hall, surrounded by beings who viewed humans the way humans viewed insects, holding his rifle while immortal creatures laughed at him. Lord Vaerion descended from his throne with predatory grace,
circling the human delegation like a cat examining wounded prey. He stopped in front of Bastien, towering over him by nearly a foot, his silver hair cascading past his shoulders like liquid metal. "Show me," Vaerion said, his voice carrying equal parts amusement and command. "Show me how this stick is supposed to threaten the Dominion." The other elves leaned forward with interest, not tactical interest, but the kind of curiosity one shows a child's toy. Bastien met Vaerion's ancient eyes and saw something that chilled him more than any magic: absolute certainty. The Elf didn't just believe humans were inferior, he knew it with the confidence of 3,000 years of living memory. Bastien gestured to the far end of the hall where a stone pillar stood carved with ancient runes. "May I?" Vaerion waved dismissively, conjuring a sphere of protective magic around himself and his council, not because he feared danger, but because he found even this minor precaution amusing. Bastien loaded the rifle with deliberate slowness, narrating each step as if teaching children. "This is called a musket ball. It's lead, heavy metal." He poured powder down the barrel. "This is the propellant, a chemical mixture that burns very fast." He primed the firing mechanism. "This creates the spark." The elves watched with expressions ranging from boredom to barely concealed laughter. One of them yawned. The rifle fired with a report that shook dust from the ancient rafters. The sound was so foreign to the elven hall, so crude, so industrial, that several elves actually flinched. The musket ball struck the stone pillar and ricocheted harmlessly away, leaving a small chip in the stonework. There was a moment of silence. Then Vaerion burst into genuine laughter, clutching his sides as if he'd just heard the finest jest in centuries. "Oh, magnificent!" he gasped between laughs. "You make noise and damage stone. Tell me, human, how long did it take you to reload that fearsome weapon? 10 seconds? 20? In that time, I could reduce your entire delegation to ash, reanimate your corpses as servants, and still have time to compose poetry about it." Bastien stood rigid, his face burning with humiliation, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "My lord, with respect, this is merely a demonstration. What you've seen is—" Vaerion cut him off with a wave. "What I have seen is desperation wearing the mask of innovation. You cannot even pierce our shields with this toy, yet you present it as if it matters. Do you know why humans lost the Great War, Engineer Moreau? Because you think in straight lines. You see a problem and build a solution. But we elves are the solution. We are evolution perfected. We need no tools because we are the tools." He gestured, and flames danced across the ceiling, forming shapes of ancient battles, elven warriors cutting through human armies like wheat. "Go home," Vaerion said, his tone suddenly cold. "Prepare your people for exodus, and know that we allowed you to leave this hall alive only because your extinction would mean less entertainment for us."
The journey back to Valdombre took 12 days through increasingly hostile territory. Bastien barely spoke, his humiliation and Luminaethel replaying in his mind like a curse. But beneath the shame, something else burned, a fury he'd never felt before. Not the hot rage that burns itself out quickly, but the cold, methodical anger of a man who has been dismissed as irrelevant by creatures who should have known better. Elaine rode beside him for most of the journey, and on the 8th night, as they camped in the ravine, she finally broke his silence. "You knew they would laugh," she said. "It wasn't a question." Bastien nodded slowly. "I needed to see their faces, needed to understand exactly how they think." He stared into the campfire. "They don't just think we're weaker, they think we're incapable of threatening them. That's the vulnerability." When they returned to Grenfel, preparations had reached a fever pitch. The deadline was 3 weeks away. Most civilians had evacuated, leaving the capital city eerily quiet, except for the industrial district where Bastien's operation continued nonstop. He gathered his core team,
Elaine, General Etienne, King Aurelian, and a handful of others who knew the full extent of their plans. In a secured room deep in the castle, Bastien unveiled what he'd been working on since returning from Luminaethel. Not just rifles, but a complete tactical doctrine. The elves think in terms of individual power. He pointed to a large map of the valley entrance. Their battle mages are supremely confident because each one can devastate an area. They're used to facing enemies who rely on similar power structures, rival mages, spirit warriors, dragon riders. They've never faced coordinated, massed fire from enemies they consider beneath notice. The plan was brutally simple. 2,000 soldiers would form in ranks at the valley's narrowest point, where the terrain created a natural bottleneck. The elven army would approach expecting the usual human response, a desperate charge perhaps, some siege equipment. Definitely panic and chaos once the magic started. Instead, they would face 4 ranks deep, each soldier armed with a rifle. The front rank would fire, then drop to one knee while reloading. The second rank would fire over their heads, then drop. Third rank, fourth rank, then back to the first. Continuous, rolling volleys of fire. It's called volley fire, Bastien explained. No single shot will break their shields, but hundreds, fired in sequence. The shields have to regenerate. There will be gaps, and all it takes is one ball to reach flesh. Elaine studied the map with growing understanding. She'd commanded men in border skirmishes, knew how to read terrain and timing. You're treating them like they're just soldiers, dangerous ones, but soldiers. Bastien nodded, because that's what they are. They're not gods. They breathe, they bleed, they have to concentrate to maintain their magic. We just need to make them understand that fast enough. He pulled out another schematic, something new that made even Elaine lean forward with interest. I call it a grenade, a hollow iron ball filled with powder and shrapnel, with a fuse. We throw them into tight formations. Even their shields can't block an explosion that starts inside their perimeter. The king, who had been silent throughout the entire gathering, finally spoke. You're asking me to gamble the lives of 2,000 men on weapons that are 3 months old, on tactics no one has ever tested, against enemies who have won every conflict for 300 years. Bastien met his gaze without flinching. Yes, your majesty, but consider this, we've already lost. The elves have declared our lands forfeit, our people are refugees. We have nothing left to lose except the chance to prove that humans are not cattle to be herded by our magical betters. We may die in that valley, probably will, but we'll die on our feet, and we'll take some of them with us. And maybe, we'll surprise them enough that they think twice before demanding surrender from the next human kingdom.
The Valley of Grenfel sat at the western edge of Valdombre, where the cultivated lands met the ancient forests of Ethermoor. Steep cliffs rose on both sides, forming a natural passage barely wide enough for an army to march 4 abreast. At its narrowest point, the valley was only 200 yards across, a perfect killing ground if you had the right weapons. For the last week, Bastien's soldiers had been fortifying this position, not with traditional walls and ramparts, but with innovations that made veteran commanders shake their heads. Earthen berms had been raised for soldiers to fire from cover. Wooden platforms created elevation for rear ranks. Most peculiarly, they'd scattered what looked like small iron barrels across the ground, barrels that ticked softly when you stood near them. Training had been conducted in absolute secrecy, at locations far from prying eyes. Most of the 2,000 soldiers were young, volunteers who had nothing to lose, who preferred a fighting death to exile. They'd spent days learning to load, aim, and fire their rifles with mechanical precision. Bastien had drilled them mercilessly. Bite the paper cartridge, pour the powder, drop the ball, ram it home, prime the pan, cock the hammer, aim at center mass, fire, repeat. The average soldier could manage 2 shots per minute by the end of training. The best could do 3. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't magical, but it was deadly, and more importantly, it was repeatable. The Elven army was spotted 3 days before the deadline. their approach announced by scouts who rode hard through the valley entrance. What they described made even Bastien's breath catch. 5,000 elves, their armor gleaming like starlight, moving through the forest in perfect formation. Banners flew that showed the ancient sigils of Ethermore's great houses. War mages walked among the ranks, their staffs crackling with barely contained power. And at the center, Lord Vaerion Silversong rode a creature that shouldn't exist. A stag the size of a warhorse, its antlers wreathed in silver flame, its eyes glowing with intelligence that predated human civilization. The night before battle, Bastien walked among his troops. Most were barely more than boys, their faces reflecting firelight from hundreds of small campfires scattered across their position. Some prayed to gods that had been silent for generations. Others checked their rifles for the 100th time, hands trembling slightly. A young soldier named Luc Chevalier, he couldn't have been more than 18, stopped Bastien as he passed. "Sir," the boy said, his voice cracking slightly, "is it true, what they say about elven magic, that they can stop our hearts with a word?" Bastien considered lying, offering false comfort. Instead, he chose truth. Yes, they can do that and worse. They can conjure fire that doesn't burn out, ice that freezes souls, winds that tear flesh from bone. They are, in every measurable way, superior to us. Luc's face fell, and several soldiers nearby stopped to listen. Bastien raised his voice so more could hear. But here's what they don't understand. Here's what Lord Vaerion, in his 3,000 years of life, has never learned. Magic requires talent. It requires bloodlines, years of study, meditation, perfect concentration. Their power is incredible, but it's personal. Our power? He hefted his rifle. Our power is in this, in simple mechanics and chemistry that any human can learn in weeks. Tomorrow, when they come expecting us to flee or beg, we're going to show them something they've never seen. We're going to show them that humans don't need magic to be dangerous. We just need to be smarter. The soldiers didn't cheer. This wasn't that kind of moment. But Bastien saw something hardened in their eyes. Resolve, maybe, or just the cold acceptance that comes before a desperate gamble. Dawn broke gray and cold, mist clinging to the valley floor like a shroud. The elven army approached with the confidence of beings who had never known true defeat. Their formation perfect, their bearing almost casual. At their head rode Lord Vaerion, his expression of mild annoyance, as if this entire affair was beneath him, a chore to be completed before returning to more interesting pursuits. Behind him, the battle mages walked in loose formation, their staffs glowing softly, ready to unleash devastation at the first sign of resistance. The elven warriors wore armor that seemed to shift and flow like liquid silver, enchanted to turn aside mundane weapons. They carried blades that could cut through stone and shields that could deflect arrows in mid-flight. Bastien watched their approach from the earthen berm, his rifle loaded and ready. Beside him stood Elaine, Etienne, and King Aurelian himself, who had insisted on staying despite protests. The king had refused to flee while his soldiers fought, refused to let others die for a plan he'd authorized. 2,000 soldiers waited in 4 precise ranks, their rifles resting against shoulders, their faces grim. The valley was so quiet that the elven army's approach seemed impossibly loud. Armor chinking, hooves on stone, the rustle of enchanted banners. When they reached a distance of 300 yards, Vaerion raised one elegant hand. His army stopped as one, their discipline perfect.
"Humans of Valdombre," Vaerion's voice carried across the valley, magically amplified. "Your deadline has passed. You were given a season to evacuate. You were shown mercy. Yet you gather here with your toys as if to resist. This is your final chance. Lay down your weapons, pledge your lands to the Dominion, and you will be allowed to leave with your lives. Resist, and we will demonstrate why humans no longer challenge elven authority." He gestured lazily, and 3 battle mages stepped forward. They raised their staffs, and the air between the 2 armies shimmered.
Suddenly, pillars of flame erupted from the ground, not near the human position, but 40 yards in front of it, a demonstration. The heat was so intense that soldiers in the front rank had to shield their faces. The flames died as quickly as they had appeared, leaving scorched earth and melted stone. Vaerion smiled. That was a fraction of our power, directed against empty ground. Imagine it directed against flesh, against shields and armor, against the very earth beneath your feet. You cannot win. You cannot even survive. So please, Engineer Moreau, he somehow spotted Bastien despite the distance, tell me you've learned your lesson about sticks. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Bastien stood, rifle in hand, and stepped forward so the elves could see him clearly. His voice wasn't magically amplified, but it carried, rough and unpolished compared to Vaerion's musical tones, but filled with something the elf couldn't recognize. Not fear, not desperation, but cold certainty. "Lord Vaerion," Bastien called out, "you asked me to demonstrate my stick in your hall. I showed you a single shot against stone. Today, I'd like to show you something different. Today, I'd like to show you 2,000 sticks, all pointed at you." He turned to General Etienne and gave a single nod. Etienne raised his hand, and 2,000 soldiers brought their rifles to bear in perfect unison, a sound like a great beast taking breath. The front rank aimed. Bastien's voice cut through the morning air. "First rank, fire!" The valley exploded with thunder. 200 rifles discharged as one, the sound so overwhelming that it seemed the world itself had cracked. White smoke erupted from the firing line, obscuring vision for a heartbeat. The musket balls, each one a half-inch of solid lead, traveling faster than sound, streaked across the 300 yards in less than a second. The elven shields flared brilliant blue as their magic activated, ancient spells woven into the very air intercepting projectiles that should have been harmless. Most balls ricocheted away, their kinetic energy absorbed by centuries-old enchantments. But 3 elven warriors stumbled, looking down in shock at wounds that shouldn't exist. One fell. Before the elves could process what had happened, Etienne's voice rang out. "First rank, reload! Second rank, fire!" Another 200 rifles spoke, adding their smoke to the growing cloud. More shields flared. 2 more elves fell, one clutching a shoulder where armor had been punched through like parchment. "Second rank, reload! Third rank, fire!" The pattern continued, merciless and mechanical. The front ranks dropped to their knees as they frantically reloaded, well-trained hands working through the motions even as their hearts hammered. The rear ranks fired over their heads. It was chaos and precision mixed together, noise and smoke and the acrid smell of burning powder. Lord Vaerion's face transformed from amused superiority to genuine shock. In 3,000 years, no one had dared attack him first. No human army had possessed weapons that could penetrate elven defenses. He raised his staff, and a wall of pure force erupted before his army, a shimmering barrier that could turn aside siege weapons. "Fourth rank, fire!" The volley struck the barrier, and most balls bounced away harmlessly. But the barrier wasn't designed for this kind of sustained assault. It flickered under the hammering impacts, microsecond gaps appearing and closing as Vaerion's concentration wavered. "First rank, ready! Fire!" The cycle had come full rotation. The soldiers had reloaded in under 20 seconds. This was Bastien's insight, born from weeks of mathematical calculation. Individual shots were survivable against elven magic, but massed fire, sustained fire, created a different equation. Each volley forced the enemy to maintain concentration, to keep shields powered, to react rather than act. Each volley was 200 chances for gaps to appear, and human soldiers, unlike elves, didn't tire from using their weapons. The rifle didn't care if you were exhausted or afraid, it just required mechanical repetition. Load, aim, fire. The elven battle mages began gathering power for a devastating counterstrike, their staffs glowing brighter. But that required time, concentration, and most importantly, coordination. It was hard to coordinate when thunder roared every 10 seconds.
Battle mages, forward! Vaerion's voice cut through the chaos, his tactical mind finally overriding his shock. 20 elven mages broke formation, sprinting toward the human position with supernatural speed, their personal shields far stronger than the infantry's. They would close the distance, get inside the effective range of these crude weapons, and then unleash the full fury of their magic. Fire would scour the valley, lightning would dance through the ranks, the humans would burn, and this insult would be answered with absolute annihilation. The mages' faces showed rage now, not the lazy superiority of before, but genuine fury at being wounded by cattle. Bastien had anticipated this. He'd studied every account of elven warfare he could find, understood that their tactics relied on overwhelming magical superiority, combined with the fear that such power generated. They expected enemies to break and run once the magic started flying. Instead, he shouted, "Grenades! Now!" Along the valley floor, hidden behind seemingly random rocks and debris, 50 soldiers emerged. Each carried one of Bastien's newest innovations, hollow iron spheres packed with powder and nails, with fuses already burning. They hurled them not at the charging mages directly, but at the ground 15 yards in front of them, calculating the time for the fuses to burn down. The grenades detonated in a staggered sequence, creating a wall of shrapnel and concussive force. The leading battle mages ran straight into the blasts, their personal shields flaring brilliantly, then shattering. Elven magic was powerful against focused attacks. A sword thrust, an arrow, even concentrated fire. But it struggled against omnidirectional force. The explosions came from below, from all sides, overwhelming the shield's ability to redirect energy. 3 mages went down immediately, their bodies torn by nails moving at lethal speeds. The others stumbled, their charge broken, their concentration shattered. One tried to summon fire, and the spell misfired, flames erupting around his own position. Another screamed, a sound of pain that echoed across the valley, shocking in its very humanness. "All ranks! Target the mages! Fire at will!" Etienne's command changed the rhythm. Instead of coordinated volleys, 800 rifles now focused on 17 surviving battle mages who were desperately trying to reform their shields and complete their spells. The air filled with so much lead that it became a storm of metal. One mage managed to summon a lance of pure lightning. It streaked toward the human lions, but he died mid-cast. 3 balls punching through his chest, the lightning went wild, striking the cliff face and bringing down a cascade of rocks that crushed 2 elven warriors behind him. Another mage completed her spell, a wave of freezing wind that should have turned the front rank into ice sculptures. But the moment she released it, a dozen rifles tracked her position. She managed to redirect 3 balls with desperate hand gestures, but the 4th caught her in the throat. The spell dissipated instantly, leaving only a cold breeze that made soldiers shiver. The other mages saw their companions falling, beings who had lived centuries, who had mastered arts that took decades to learn, cut down by weapons wielded by humans who'd trained for weeks. The psychological impact was devastating. For the first time in living memory, elven battle mages retreated. Vaerion watched his elite forces fall back in disarray, and something dangerous ignited in his ancient eyes. He was done playing, done observing. The Lord of Luminaethel raised both hands, and the very air around him began to crystallize with power. His voice resonated with harmonics that predated language, words of binding, of destruction, of fundamental forces being bent to will. The sky darkened despite the morning sun. Temperature plummeted. Frost spread across the ground in fractal patterns. Every human in the valley felt it. A pressure on their chests, a weight on their souls, the sensation of staring into an abyss that stared back. Bastien recognized the signs from ancient texts. This was high magic, the kind that had broken entire human armies. Vaerion was going to unleash something catastrophic, probably a storm of ice that would freeze every living thing in the valley. It would take him perhaps 30 seconds to complete the working, requiring absolute concentration and perfect execution. 30 seconds that would determine everything. Bastien's mind raced through calculations, trajectories,
timing. Then he made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal. He grabbed his rifle, loaded it with a ball he'd been saving. One cast from silver taken from Valdombre's last treasury reserves, blessed by every priest still in the kingdom. He aimed not at Vaerion's center mass, not at his shielded torso, but at the glowing crystal staff the elf held above his head. "Cease fire!" Bastien's shout cut through the battle. "Everyone, cease fire!" For a moment that stretched like eternity, the guns went silent. 2,000 soldiers stopped, hands frozen in mid-reload, watching their engineers stand alone on the berm. Vaerion's spell built to a crescendo, frost now covering everything within 20 yards of him, the air itself beginning to crystallize. Bastien exhaled slowly, let his heartbeat settle, and squeezed the trigger. The silver ball left the barrel at over 1,000 feet per second. It crossed 300 yards in less than a second. Vaerion's personal shield flared brilliant blue, redirecting the projectile, but the ball's trajectory had never been aimed at Vaerion himself. It struck the crystal staff directly, and ancient magical focus shattered like glass.
The backlash from the interrupted spell was immediate and catastrophic. Magic that had been building for a high working with nowhere to discharge tore through Vaerion's body like lightning seeking ground. He screamed, a sound so filled with agony and disbelief that it froze both armies in place. The Lord of Luminaethel, who had lived 3 millennia, who had never known defeat, fell from his spirit stag and hit the ground hard. Smoke rose from his armor where magical energy had burned through enchantments designed to last forever. His perfect silver hair was now streaked with char. And most shocking of all, blood, red as any human's, seeped from his nose and ears. The elven army stood paralyzed. Their commanders had trained for every battlefield scenario over centuries of warfare. They knew how to respond to ambushes, flanking maneuvers, cavalry charges, even dragon attacks. But they had no protocol for watching their immortal lord, a being who had commanded armies before most of them were born, brought low by a human with a stick. The psychological impact was more devastating than any weapon. If Vaerion could fall, if Vaerion could bleed, then perhaps elves weren't the unkillable demigods they'd believed themselves to be. Perhaps this battle wasn't the foregone conclusion they'd assumed it to be. Etienne recognized the moment of shock and seized it like a drowning man grabbing a rope. "All ranks, volley fire, resume!" The thunder began again, systematic and merciless. But now the elven shields were weaker, maintained by warriors whose confidence had shattered along with their lord's staff. More gaps appeared, more elves fell. Not many, their armor was still far superior, their reflexes still superhuman, but enough. A steady trickle of casualties that had never happened before, that wasn't supposed to be possible. One elf fell clutching his leg, another took a ball to the shoulder, a third caught one in the face when he raised his visor to see better through the smoke. The elven commanders finally rallied, issuing orders in their melodious language. The infantry formed a shield wall, overlapping their protections to create a stronger barrier. Archers, armed with bows that could puncture steel at 400 yards, began loosing arrows in high arcs. The arrows fell like deadly rain, their tips glowing with minor enchantments. Human soldiers died, dozens in the first volley alone. A young soldier next to Bastien took an arrow through the chest, his eyes going wide with surprise before he toppled backward. Another fell with an arrow in the throat, gurgling and clawing at the shaft. The human lines wavered, discipline threatening to break under this onslaught. But Alain had prepared for this too. "Cover!" she shouted, and soldiers dove behind the earthen berms and wooden shields they'd positioned. The next volley of arrows struck barriers instead of flesh. Bastien had insisted on the defensive positions, understanding that their rifles gave them range, but not protection. The berms weren't perfect. Some arrows still found targets, and the human casualties mounted, but they broke the devastating effect of elven archery. Meanwhile, human rifles continued firing from cover, their balls punching through the shield wall with mathematical inevitability. The elves were caught in a terrible equation.
They could advance and face grenades and point-blank fire, retreat and admit defeat to creatures they considered inferior, or hold position and slowly be whittled down by an enemy that could reload faster than they could heal. Lord Vaerion struggled to his feet, supported by 2 of his royal guard. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage, blood still trickling from one ear where the magical backlash had ruptured something internal. He could hear his warriors dying, each death a psychic wound to his ancient consciousness, each loss a piece of elven immortality snuffed out by human tools. The humiliation burned worse than any physical pain. These cattle, these mayflies who lived barely a century had wounded him, had killed his battle mages, had turned his army's advance into a bloody stalemate. The shame of it would echo through elven history forever. "Forward!" Vaerion's command cracked like a whip. "All forces, advance! Close the distance!" It was a desperate order born from rage rather than tactics, but the elven warriors obeyed without question. They began moving toward the human position at a run, shields raised, accepting casualties to close the gap where these primitive weapons would be less effective. The elven archers continued their reign of death, forcing human soldiers to keep their heads down. The distance closed, 200 yards, 150, 100. At this range, the rifle fire became even more devastating. Elves fell in greater numbers, their superhuman speed meaning nothing against projectiles that moved faster than sound. But the elves kept coming, and Bastien's heart sank as he realized they might actually reach the human lines. Once they did, it would be over. Elven warriors with enchanted blades fighting conscripted farmers with bayonets. The outcome was certain. He'd known this was a possibility, had planned for it, but the reality still chilled him. He caught Etienne's eye across the smoking battlefield. The general nodded grimly, understanding passing between them without words. They'd bought time. They'd proven humans could fight back. Now they would sell their lives as dearly as possible.
Then Elaine grabbed Bastien's shoulder and pointed toward the cliff face. "Look! The secondary charges!" In their preparations, they'd planted explosives along the unstable sections of the valley walls, a last desperate measure in case the battle went badly. Fuses had been lit when the grenades went off, time to burn for precisely 15 minutes. Bastien had calculated that if the elves pushed hard, they'd be directly beneath those cliff sections when the charges blew. But the timing was tight, and if they detonated too early or too late, it would all be for nothing. He pulled out his pocket watch, hands shaking as he counted down. 10 seconds. 5. 3. The explosions rippled along both cliff faces simultaneously, precisely choreographed chaos. Tons of rock and earth came crashing down directly onto the elven advance. The sound was apocalyptic, louder even than the rifles, a grinding roar of stone crushing stone. Dust and debris filled the valley like a storm. The elven formation, which had been pressing forward with fierce determination, was caught directly in the avalanche. Dozens were buried instantly, their enchanted armor useless against the sheer weight of falling earth. Others were struck by boulders the size of houses. The advance sattered, and suddenly the elves were the ones in disarray, scrambling backward to escape the rockslide. When the dust finally settled, the valley's geography had changed. What had been a clear passage was now partially blocked by tons of rubble, creating a natural barrier between the two armies. More importantly, the elven force was divided. Perhaps 500 warriors had been caught on the human side of the rockfall, separated from their main force and their commanders. These trapped elves found themselves in a nightmare scenario, surrounded by enemies armed with weapons they didn't understand, cut off from support, with nowhere to retreat. They formed a defensive circle, shields overlocked, but their faces showed something humans had never seen on elven features before: fear. Bastien made a decision that surprised even himself. "Cease fire," he called out, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. The rifles gradually fell silent, though soldiers kept them trained on the trapped elves. In the ringing silence that followed, Bastien stepped forward, approaching the elven circle alone. Etienne tried to stop him, but Bastien waved him off. He stopped 20 yards from the nearest elf, close enough to be heard, far enough to dive for cover if they attacked. "You're trapped," he called out in the elven tongue.
words he'd learned from ancient texts. Your lord is wounded. Your advance is broken. You can die here, or you can surrender. We're not monsters. We don't slaughter the defenseless. An elven captain, her armor marked with centuries of service, stepped forward, her expression a mixture of shock and something that might have been grudging respect. You speak the ancient language? Her voice was musical even in distress. Bastien nodded. I studied your histories, your wars, your tactics. That's how I knew to fight you. You've spent 3,000 years believing humans are inferior. That made you predictable. The elf captain looked at the rifles still trained on her people, at the earthen fortifications, at the evidence of human ingenuity scattered across the battlefield. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet. We were wrong about you. Yes, Bastien said simply. You were. Now, do you surrender? The captain looked back at her trapped warriors. Most were wounded, all were exhausted, and the psychological impact of their impossible situation showed on every face. She drove her sword into the ground, an ancient elven gesture of yield. We surrender, but know this, human. Lord Vaerion will not. His pride will not allow it. He will regroup, bring reinforcements, and return. You've won this battle. But Bastien cut her off. Let him try. Every kingdom between here and the eastern mountains knows that elves can bleed, that human weapons can match elven magic, that we're not cattle to be herded. If he comes back, we'll be ready. And next time, we'll have more rifles, more soldiers, more grenades. How many battles can elven pride survive? On the far side of the rockfall, Vaerion heard the surrender and felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with physical injury. His warriors, elves who had sworn eternal loyalty, who had never known defeat, had yielded to humans. The shame was unbearable, but worse than shame was the cold calculation forming in his ancient mind. This engineer Moreau is right. The weapons were reproducible. The tactics could be copied. If word spread that a mere 2,000 humans had stopped an elven army, that would encourage other kingdoms to resist. The careful order of the world, where elves ruled supreme and others knew their place, was cracking, and all because he'd laughed at a stick. The battlefield fell into an exhausted quiet, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackling of small fires where powder had ignited wooden structures. Human soldiers moved among their fallen comrades, their faces showing the hollow shock of men who had survived something they shouldn't have. Medics worked frantically on those who could be saved, but the cost had been terrible. Of the 2,000 who had stood at dawn, nearly 400 lay dead or dying. Another 300 carried wounds that would mark them forever. The valley floor was painted red with human blood, and victory tasted like ash in Bastien's mouth. He walked among the casualties, stopping at each to offer what comfort he could. A hand on the shoulder, a promise that their sacrifice mattered. He found young Luc Chevalier lying against a berm, his leg shattered by an elven arrow. The boy looked up at Bastien with eyes too old for his face. Did we win, sir? His voice was thready with pain. Bastien knelt beside him. Yes, we won. The elves are retreating. Luc managed a weak smile. Good. That's good. He closed his eyes, and for a moment Bastien thought he'd died, but then he felt the faint pulse in the boy's wrist. Alive, but barely. The medics would have to work miracles. King Aurelian found Bastien an hour later, standing alone atop the highest berm, watching the elven army beyond the rockfall. They were withdrawing, carrying their dead and wounded with them, their formation disciplined despite the defeat. The king looked older than his years, his face lined with grief. 700 casualties, Bastien. 700 of our people. Is this what victory looks like? Bastien didn't turn from his vigil. It's what survival looks like, Your Majesty. If we'd fled, the elves would have taken our lands, and we'd be refugees in hostile kingdoms. If we'd stayed without fighting, they'd have slaughtered us for sport. This way we hurt them. made them respect us, made them think twice. But at what cost? The king pressed. Bastien finally turned, and Aurelian was shocked by the haunted look in the engineer's eyes. Every life lost today weighs on me. Every mother who won't see her son again, every child who lost a father. I know exactly what this cost. But you asked me for an alternative to extinction, and I gave you one. Was it pretty? No. War never is. Was it honorable? I don't know. But it was effective. And now, instead of being remembered as the king who surrendered Valdombre without a fight, you'll be remembered as the king who stood against the Dominion and won. Elaine approached them, her clothes stained with powder and blood from helping the medics. The prisoners want to speak with you, she said to Bastien. The captain, specifically. Bastien followed her to where the captured elves sat under guard. They'd been given water and their wounds treated, a courtesy that seemed to surprise them. The captain looked up as Bastien approached, her ancient eyes studying him with new intensity. You're going to release us, aren't you? It wasn't really a question. Bastien nodded. You surrendered honorably. We'll tend your wounded, then let you rejoin your people. We're not conquerors. We don't want your lands or your lives. We just want to be left alone. The sun was setting when Lord Vaerion called his remaining commanders to council. They met in a hastily erected tent, the ancient elf sitting with visible pain, his body still recovering from the magical backlash. Around him stood the survivors of his officer corps, their faces reflecting a range of emotions Vaerion had never seen before: confusion, anger, and worst of all, doubt. They had lost nearly 800 warriors, including most of their battle mages. The humans had lost more, but that wasn't the point. Elves weren't supposed to lose anyone to human weapons. The fundamental assumption of their superiority had been shattered. We attack at dawn, Vaerion announced, his voice strained but firm. Full assault. We clear the rockfall, bring forward our remaining mages, and we burn that valley to bedrock. No more arrogance, no more testing. We end this. But the captain who had surrendered, her name was Thessalia, and she'd served Vaerion for 2 centuries, spoke up with uncharacteristic boldness. My lord, we need to reconsider. These humans have weapons we don't understand, tactics we've never faced. If we attack again, our casualties will be... Vaerion's hand slammed against the table with enough force to crack the wood. I do not care about casualties. We are elves. We do not retreat from humans. We do not negotiate with cattle. Thessalia stood her ground. They're not cattle, my lord. They're warriors who defended their homes against impossible odds. They captured us and treated us with honor. They innovated weapons that can pierce our shields. They've proven that magic isn't invincible. If we attack again, we might win, but the cost... She gestured to the tent entrance, where the wounded lay in rows. How many more of our people are you willing to sacrifice for pride? Vaerion stood, swaying slightly, his face contorted with rage. You dare question me? After 3,000 years? After centuries of service? Thessalia met his eyes without flinching. I questioned a decision that will waste elven lives needlessly. There are other human kingdoms, my lord. If word spreads that we won, but at terrible cost, it will encourage resistance everywhere. But if we withdraw now, if we admit we underestimated them and offer terms... The other commanders stirred, some nodding agreement, others looking shocked that anyone would suggest negotiation. Vaerion saw the dissent spreading through his ranks like poison. In 3 millennia, he'd never faced rebellion from his own people. But then, in 3 millennia, he'd never led them to defeat.
The truth settled over him like a burial shroud. He could order another attack, and his warriors would obey, but they would do so without the absolute faith they'd always had. The myth of elven invincibility had been broken, and once broken, it could never be fully restored. He could win the battle and lose something far more precious, his people's unquestioning belief in their own supremacy.
Vaerion sat heavily, his ancient bones suddenly feeling their age. "What terms would you suggest?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Thessalia spoke carefully. "We acknowledge Valdombre's borders as sovereign. We guarantee no further expansion into human territories, at least from Aethermore. In exchange, they agree not to share their weapons technology with other kingdoms. We prevent these rifles from spreading." Vaerion laughed bitterly. "You think they'll agree, after humiliating us?" Thessalia nodded. "I think Engineer Moreau is smart enough to understand that he won one battle, not the war. If we return with our full might, dragons, high mages, the ancient weapons, we could still destroy them, but both sides would suffer terribly. He seems like a man who counts costs, who would rather rebuild than fight forever." The next morning, instead of war horns, the human soldiers heard something they'd never expected: a white flag approaching under the banner of parley. Bastien stood on the berm, rifle in hand, watching 3 elven figures approach. Lord Vaerion was not among them. His pride wouldn't allow it. But Captain Thessalia was, flanked by 2 elders who looked ancient even by elven standards. Bastien descended to meet them at neutral ground, bringing only Elaine and King Aurelian with him. The 5 stood in the morning mist, surrounded by the evidence of yesterday's carnage, and negotiated the future. The terms were simple. Valdombre's current borders would be recognized as permanent and sovereign. The Dominion of Aethermore would withdraw all claims and guarantee no military action against the kingdom or its people. In exchange, Valdombre would agree not to distribute rifle technology to other human kingdoms for a period of 20 years, and would establish a diplomatic channel for future disputes. It wasn't everything either side wanted, but it was something both sides could accept. Thessalia added one final clause. Lord Vaerion wishes it known that had he been at full strength, the outcome would have been different. Bastien allowed himself a thin smile. Had we been at full strength, with 5,000 rifles instead of 2,000, the outcome would have been very different as well. Let's both agree we're fortunate this ended when it did. The captured elves were released that afternoon, and by evening the forest was empty of the Dominion's forces. They left behind their dead, a concession that spoke volumes about how thoroughly their confidence had been shaken. Elves traditionally recovered all fallen warriors for elaborate ceremonies. Leaving them to human mercy was an admission that they'd been forced to retreat in haste. Bastien ordered the elven dead be buried with honor, their weapons and armor carefully preserved. Someday, he told his soldiers, people will visit these graves and remember, not just that we fought, but that we fought honorably, that we proved humans could stand against gods and win. The weeks that followed were a blur of rebuilding and mourning. Funerals were held for the 700 who had fallen, their names inscribed on a monument built at the valley entrance. The survivors were hailed as heroes, and the thunder of Grenfel became a story told across every human kingdom. Bastien found himself uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to focus on training more soldiers and building more rifles. Because he knew, they all knew, that this was just the beginning. The elves would never forget this defeat. Other magical races would hear of it and draw their own conclusions. The world had changed, and humans were no longer content to be subjects of more powerful beings. 6 months later,
Ambassadors from a dozen human kingdoms arrived in Grenfel, all asking about the weapons that had stopped an elven army. Bastien met with them in the rebuilt workshop, surrounded by his newest innovations. He'd developed rifling that improved accuracy, faster loading mechanisms, and even experimental designs for multi-shot weapons. But he was careful about what he shared, remembering his agreement. "These weapons are tools," he told the ambassadors. "Powerful tools, but just tools. They don't make us equal to elves or dragons or any other magical race, but they do something more important. They give us a chance, a fighting chance, and sometimes that's all you need." King Aurelian stood on the castle walls that evening, watching the sun set over the valley where his people had made their stand. Beside him, Bastien watched the same sunset, his mind already racing with new designs, new innovations, new ways to ensure that humans would never again be dismissed as primitive. "You changed the world," the king said quietly. Bastien shook his head. "No, Your Majesty. We just reminded the world of something it had forgotten, that humans don't need magic to be dangerous. We just need to be smarter, more determined, and willing to stand up when everyone expects us to kneel. We proved that sticks wielded by free people can match spells cast by tyrants, and that's a lesson the world won't forget." Far away in Luminaethel, Lord Vaerion stood in his hall of crystal and moonstone, his body healed but his pride forever scarred. He stared at the broken pieces of his staff, now mounted as a reminder. Some of his council urged another war, a campaign to crush Valdombre and erase this humiliation. Others suggested embracing this new reality, perhaps even learning from these humans. Vaerion listened to them argue, his ancient mind turning over the implications. In 3,000 years, he had never been forced to change his understanding of the world. But perhaps that was the problem. Perhaps, he thought bitterly, that was why these mayfly humans had beaten him. Because they were willing to innovate, to try new things, to embrace change rather than cling to ancient superiority. He made no decision that day. But deep in his immortal heart, Lord Vaerion Silversong knew that the age of unquestioned elven dominance had ended. The humans had their thunder now, their terrible sticks that spoke with the voice of lightning. And though he would never admit it aloud, though his pride would never allow the words to pass his lips, he understood what had really happened in that valley. The humans hadn't just won a battle. They'd won their dignity, their right to be respected, their place in a world that had tried to keep them subjected. And that, more than any weapon, was what made them truly dangerous. The age of fantasy fuck yeah had begun, and nothing would ever be the same.